While assessing which movie to analyze next, I stumbled upon this 2012 interview with director Dante for a re-release of his film Gremlins, in which he confesses integrating a subtle theme of anti-consumerism into the film. Generally thinking of Gremlins as a kids' movie, I was totally taken by surprise when finding out that there are a handful of theories about the film's subtext out there, the most common one being that the movie is racist or secretly about racism.
I read your entire 15-page unsolicited treatise on why the Gremlins is actually about suburban white fear of black culture.
The Gremlins are loud, talking slang, are addicted to fried chicken, and freak out when you get their hair wet.
What struck me as interesting after watching Gremlins a couple of times and made me want to investigate it further were the little subtle touches throughout the film, such as the foreshadowing in the antique shop. We can see dragons, lizards, claws, and a statue with pointy ears, all being very similar to the look of a gremlin. Or Mr. Futterman's speech about the Gremlins bringing down planes in World War II being referenced in this little snippet.
Gremlins. You gotta watch out for the foreigners because they plant gremlins in their machinery. That's the same gremlins brought down our planes in the big one.
Big one.
That's right. World War II. Good old WWII.
Also, what I appreciated was the translation of the screenplay into the movie. The script, for example, is much more violent than the film. It explicitly describes the Gremlins as man-eaters, which has been dropped in the final film and is only subtly referenced in this scene, where one can see a gremlin devouring human-shaped Christmas cookies. There is definitely a lot going on in Gremlins, but to me the biggest mystery of the movie is why the Mogwai turn evil at all. If we take a look at the first Mogwai who turns into a gremlin, the case seems to be clear. The creature seems perfectly friendly at first, then it gets its blood drawn by Mr. Hansen under terrible pain, resembling animal experimentation, later steals a sandwich, turns into a gremlin, and kills Mr. Hansen, leaving a syringe stuck in his body. A clear revenge motive. Or is it? Because the other Mogwai seem to be evil from the out. When Pete tries to pet Stripe, just after hatching, Stripe tries to bite Pete, which causes the other Mogwai to giggle.
Isn't that incredible, Pete? Yeah, right.
Later they bully Gizmo and Barney the dog, and trick Billy into feeding them after midnight. All of this seemingly without any motive. What makes it even more confusing is that Gizmo keeps his friendly, good-natured character all throughout the movie, even easily rejecting the opportunity to be fed after midnight at one point. In the script, there is no friendly Mogwai. They all just start running amok at some point, already having eaten Barney the dog before transforming. The closing speech of the Chinese shop owner offers some clarification as to why the Mogwai turned evil.
I warned you. With Mogwai comes much responsibility. But you didn't listen, and you see what happens.
But I didn't mean it.
You do with Mogwai what your society has done with all of nature's gifts. You do not understand. You are not ready.
So what he's saying is that the Mogwai have been spoiled somehow. It's all very cryptic.
Little green men continue to circulate. More from
You teach him to watch television.
His opposition to Gizmo watching television is easily understood though, because Gizmo seems to be very susceptible to what he sees on screen. A scene from To Please a Lady, Gizmo sees on television, inspires him to heroically drive to Billy's rescue at the end of the film.
Now I can see. It takes a certain kind of guy.
And that guy needs a certain kind of dame.
It takes a certain kind of guy.
And that guy needs a certain kind of pain.
Like Gizmo, the other Mogwai seem to be influenced by their surroundings also. The mayhem the Pelzer inventions cause is mirrored by the mayhem the Gremlins cause later, sometimes in very specific ways. The Gremlins give off clouds of smoke, just like the Pelzer smokeless ashtray, and the way they toss letters out of the mailbox is visually similar to the malfunctioning card dealing machine that Rand is working on. How appropriate that Rand labels the newly hatched Mogwai as the Pelzer pets and thinks about marketing them to a mass audience.
You know what? What? I'll bet every kid in America would like to have one of these. They might even replace the dog as the family pet. Think about it. The Pelzer pet. This could really be the big one.
Also note what Billy's mom says about Rand's inventions.
Dad's machines, they work so well the first couple of weeks, and use this thing.
So they seem to work great at first, but then they cause chaos, similar to a Mogwai who's cute at first, but then causes chaos as well. Overall, there are a lot of ways in which the Gremlins imitate their environment, most notably by aping the townspeople of Kingston Falls. The Gremlin who strangles Billy's mother hides in a Christmas tree at first, like Pete does. The newly hatched Mogwai want to hurt Billy's dog, like Mrs. Deagle.
I want your dog.
Barney?
Give him to me. I'll take him to the kennel. They'll put him to sleep. It'll be quick and painless compared to what I could do to him.
The Gremlins in front of Mrs. Deagle's house pose as the town's Christmas carolers, and the Gremlins in Dory's tavern are dressed up like public characters from the town. We can see Gremlins dressed as Mr. Futterman, Mrs. Deagle, the town's sheriff, Dory, and Stripe with his silver hair looks an awful lot like Mr. Corbin, the bank manager. On that point, consider this. In a deleted scene, we learn that Mrs. Deagle is pushing the bank to foreclose homes to make way for a chemical plant.
She's forcing the bank to foreclose on all of their mortgages.
And in the bit where the Gremlins play poker in Dory's tavern, the Gremlin dressed as Mrs. Deagle sits right next to Stripe, ordering him to shoot a fellow Gremlin, all highly symbolical. Billy's drawing of a hybrid between Mrs. Deagle and a dragon being attacked by a young man with a sword, who's trying to defend a woman, not only serves as foreshadowing for this scene, in which Billy decapitates a Gremlin with a sword who's strangling his mother, it also manages to associate Mrs. Deagle with the Gremlins. In the picture, she's depicted with having claws and reptilian skin, resembling a gremlin. With this in mind, the anti-consumerism theme that Joe Dante was talking about makes a whole lot more sense. The Gremlins cause a lot of their havoc, while excessively consuming entertainment, food, alcohol, and tobacco. Given that the Gremlins are very influenceable, Christmas time seems to have turned them into mindless consumers. Makes sense, though to me the Gremlins don't only act randomly for the sake of it. Their actions often rather seem to be geared towards their victims. I've already mentioned the revenge motif in Mr. Hansen's killing, but other Gremlin attacks follow a similar pattern. Mr. Corbin, the bent-on-punctuality bank manager, is killed and covered with clogs.
Maybe I'll put him in my spin dryer on high heat.
Mrs. Deagle, who threatened to put Barney the dog in a spin dryer, is herself spun around in her circular staircase, and the Gremlins attack Mr. Futterman with his beloved snowplow. With this in mind, the Gremlins seem to be more like the town's reckoning, in that they use poetic justice or rather mirror punishments. Having said that, the events in the movie can also be explained differently. What struck me while recently watching Gremlins is that Billy doesn't only ruin the diet of his pets, but apparently can't even manage his own. He has a Coke, a sandwich, and candy right before going to bed, and falls asleep while watching a horror film, which is of course a perfect recipe for nightmares. The film Billy watches is the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, in which the population of a town gets replaced by identical alien duplicates. Sound familiar? In an earlier scene, we can see the seed pods from which the aliens emerge, which look similar to the cocoons the Gremlins hatch out from. The events in Invasion of the Body Snatchers are told from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, who is believed to be deranged. The scene Billy and Gizmo watch while falling asleep marks the transition from narration to reality. What I'm saying is, if you haven't guessed it already, that what happens to Billy and the town of Kingston Falls after Billy feeds the Mogwai only happened in Billy's mind, that it was all just a horror film and sandwich-induced nightmare. If you're thinking, well, that sounds pretty far-fetched, you're right, it probably does. But consider that not only the movie Billy is watching bears striking similarities to the mayhem the Gremlins cause, but also to things he experienced earlier in the film, like his drawing, the malfunctioning Peltzer inventions, the misbehavior of the Mogwai, his first meeting with Gizmo, and Mr. Futterman's speech about the Gremlins. Also, the pattern of victims is quite convenient for Billy. His mom and dad, his friends Pete and Kate, are all fine in the end, whereas people who inconvenience Billy end up being killed or injured. Also note that the mirror punishments of the Gremlins often only have significance in the context of the victim's interaction with Billy. The bank manager only hassles Billy about punctuality, Mr. Futterman mainly unloads his xenophobia towards Billy, and Mrs. Deagle's death is only appropriate in the revenge sense from Billy's perspective. Having threatened to kill a dog isn't the worst thing Mrs. Deagle does in the film, objectively speaking. Pushing a bank to foreclose homes to make way for a chemical plant certainly is a worse deed than that, but to Billy it probably isn't. So were Mrs. Deagle's death a mirror punishment for her crimes against the townspeople of Kingston Falls, she probably would have died by being poisoned or by being crushed by a collapsing house or something. Instead, she dies in a bizarre way, mirroring her threat against Billy. The surreal, dreamlike nature of Mrs. Deagle's death was noticed in this review show.
Just based on the time alone that she's spiraling upward, this woman must have 3 or 4 stories worth of staircase in the middle of her house. But then, nope, only 1 story of stairs.
So although the events that unfold after Billy feeds the Mogwai are horrible, they are in line with Billy's wishes, especially the romance that ensues between Kate and him, of which he was thinking right before falling asleep. In the script, it is also quite clear that Billy dreams of becoming a hero. His arc is even described that way. A notable exception to this pattern, however, is the death of Mr. Hansen, that Billy certainly wouldn't wish for. He, however, learns that Mr. Hansen wants to conduct an animal experiment, which Billy, who's quite the animal lover, certainly isn't happy about. So last time I was promising to do an analysis of Jim Carrey's movie Yes Man, and I've actually taken a look at a number of Jim Carrey's old movies again, and the one that really stands out for me is not Yes Man, but rather The Mask from 1994. Now the movie has little going on in terms of a subtext. There are some interesting things to point out, however. The main theme of the movie is expressed in this scene.
So Dr. Newman, you're saying that everybody wears a mask?
That's correct, Wendy. We all wear masks, metaphorically speaking. We suppress the id, our darkest desires, and adopt a more socially acceptable image.
Well, the book is, of course, The Masks We Wear by Dr. Arthur Newman. Thank you so much.
And this theme of deception is not only applicable to Jim Carrey's character Stanley Ipkiss, but also to other characters like Tina when she spies on the bank, or to Peggy, who secretly works for the mob. I would have wished for more consistency in the theme though. Other characters like Dorian or Lieutenant Calloway don't play act at all in the film. Apart from that, the movie contains 2 sets of very interesting patterns. Firstly, a piggy bank is strangely used twice to represent corruption. First in this scene.
Back off, monkey boy! Before I tell your daddy you're running this place like it's your own personal piggy bank. Or maybe we should call the IRS and see if we can arrange a little vacation for you at Club Fat!
and then again later in the third act. The big jackpot for the gambling night in the Coco Bongo Club is collected in a giant piggy bank that is labeled War Orphans Fund. And secondly, there is an interesting pattern that could actually be called subtext. Whenever Stanley Ipkiss wears the mask, he loses his social inhibitions. On Wikipedia, the mask's powers are even described this way. He feels the urge to dance and party, his character comes out more unfiltered, he oversleeps, feels miserable, and can't quite remember the last night after wearing the mask.
What's a dream? What's a dream?
Well, can you guess what I'm getting at here? The mask can be understood to be a metaphor for alcohol. This is played so consistently that I shouldn't be at all surprised if it is an intended part of the movie's subliminal design. Of the film, Barry increasingly assumes the roles of his surrogate fathers, first by claiming to be the Esquire of Barryville.
Mr. Quinn can have satisfaction any time he pleases by calling on Redmond Barry, Esquire of Berryville.
One can read Pan Am Shuttle. This is interesting considering that Haywood Floyd took a Pan Am space shuttle first to the Taurus space station and then a spacecraft to the moon manned with Pan Am personnel.